Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to remind you to turn your phones to silent. And if you are, and you'll forgive me, I'm going to speak in young people dialect now. If you're tweeting or Instagramming, the hashtag is #ADLWWW. And there will, of course, be a book signing at the end of the session. We would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. And Don will be so proud of us that we start our sessions like that. My name is Anthony Durkin, and I'm a barrister, and I'm not an author. And the author that we have with us this afternoon is Angela Woollacott. I better put my glasses on for this. Angela Woollacott is the Manning Clark Professor of History at the ANU, an elected Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and the Australian Academy of Humanities, and a former President of the Australian Historical Association. Her new book, Don Dunstan, The Visionary Politician Who Changed Australia, was supported by an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant. She has also recently published with Michelle Arrow, Everyday Revolutions, Remaking Gender, Sexuality and Culture in 1970s Australia. She has served on advisory bodies at the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their Historical Research section, and in 2012 she was the series editor for high school textbooks in 4 volumes for the new National Curriculum in History. And the topic of her book that we'll be discussing this afternoon is, I have said, Don Dunstan, the Visionary Politician Who Changed Australia. And on the front cover is a quote from Gough Whitlam saying, "No one has done more to transform his community and society and the whole of Australia." And I was thinking, Angela, that if Gough Whitlam was prepared to say that no one has done more, then he must have been pretty significant indeed.
I think so.
So can I ask you please to welcome Angela, who's going to address us for about 20-25 minutes to begin with.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's really a great pleasure to be back in my hometown of Adelaide. I know that many people here have their own memories and knowledge of Don Dunstan. But just to refresh us all, let me begin with a brief list of Don Dunstan's achievements in office. As Premier of South Australia from 1967 to 68 and 1970 to 79, he blazed a trail of reform. First of all, leading the ALP's long, hard slog against the gerrymander in South Australia, ending decades of entrenched Conservative rule and introducing a genuinely democratic constitution and electoral system, as well as enabling his vision of social democracy in one state. Dunstan captured the mood for reform growing around the nation and led the way politically. His pioneering work on racial discrimination and Aboriginal land rights produced landmark achievements that also helped to catalyse support for Aboriginal national inclusion in the 1967 referendum. His work to prohibit all forms of discrimination and to promote equal opportunity was a beacon of political change at a time when the women's liberation and gay rights movements were erupting. Capital punishment was abolished, consumer protections were introduced, and both censorship and drinking laws were relaxed. He fostered the arts politically and personally, standing for both cosmopolitanism and the celebration of Australian cultural achievements. Indeed, he even performed here in the Adelaide Festival of Arts in 1974 on a specially made stage at the Adelaide Zoo, reading Ogden Nash's verses to Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals, accompanied by a small orchestra to 2 sold-out nights. And he promoted multiculturalism while also urging Australians to embrace other nations in their Asia-Pacific region. Dunstan articulated the reasons for reform and for investment in new areas and showed how change could be implemented in legislation and practical innovation. So that's my thumbnail sketch, but we can also consider what others said about him, starting in February 1999 at the time of his death and the state memorial service for him. And as Anthony just quoted from the front cover a little bit on the book, former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam said, quote, It is difficult to rekindle the brightness of the light which seemed to shine from Adelaide around Australia during the Dunstan years. The fact is that no one has done more to transform his own community and society, and by his example, the whole of Australia, end quote. Indigenous elder and former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission chairwoman, Lowitja O'Donoghue, noted that Dunstan's legacy to Aboriginal people was huge. Quote, "Many of our people knew him well and loved him," end quote. Ngarrindjeri Ghana artist Muriel Vanderbilt said Dunstan had been always available to the Aboriginal community and could be described as a saviour to them. Another former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, said that Dunstan had been a star in the Australian political firmament, whose contributions nationally were especially important. Quote, "I recall and cherish his leadership of the campaign to remove the White Australia policy from the platform of the ALP. More than 30 years ago, he argued that this policy was morally repugnant, and with a prescience about the importance of Asia to Australia's future, that it was economically insane. His forethought, intelligence and sensitivity was largely instrumental in ridding us of this sacred cow, which did our party and our country an accumulating disservice," end quote. In 2012, Michael Kirby, former Justice of the High Court of Australia, would recall Don Dunstan's magnificent voice. Quote, "He was like a Pavarotti of politicians. He had beautiful cadences in his voice," end quote. In Kirby's view, Dunstan achieved notable reforms right across the board. Quote, "I can't think of any other state premier who was in the same league as he. He was an outstanding Australian, an outstanding human being, and a courageous one. And I think as a bisexual or gay man, he was also an example of courage in a time when it was much more difficult," end quote. 6 years ago, veteran political commentator Mungo McCullum wrote about the extraordinary, the unique Donald Allen Dunstan. He said, quote, "Dunstan, as premier of a minor and traditionally extremely stuffy state, turned things upside down. Suddenly, South Australia was the pace setter for social change in Australia, a centre for the arts and artists, and perhaps more importantly, something of a sanctuary for those fleeing the less tolerant regimes to the east. Adelaide, traditionally the city of churches, became known only half-jokingly as the Athens of the South," end quote. In sum, he considered Dunstan was the statesman, the architect of what was for Australia a genuinely new kind of society. And finally, in 2017, when the Qantas magazine asked Maggie Beer who was her personal hero, she replied, "Don Dunstan, a man so far ahead of his time, a great intellect, an amazing leader, and a passionate cook," end quote. Since my book was published in August, I've been very gratified by some of the personal emails I have received from people who have read it, especially people who knew Dunstan or who worked with him. It's pleasing, for example, when such people say that I have captured him, that they learned much they didn't know about him, and that even though they regarded him highly before, the book has added to their regard. But what I want to focus on now are the ways in which the published reviews of my book have contributed to the recent and increasingly clamorous public discussion about leadership in Australia. After the catastrophic summer that we've had and what many see as a failure of political leadership on climate change, it's not a big surprise that there is a national conversation happening about our current political leaders and alternate visions of leadership. For example, in December, Sam Roggeveen of the Lowy Institute commented that, quote, "One of the most important trends in Australian democracy is one of the least discussed. Our politics is dominated by two parties that the public simply don't care about," end quote. Just a few days before, Sue Peters-Hawke had written, following her father Bob Hawke's death, quote, "One of the themes that emerged most forcefully during the public memorial for Dad was a vivid sense of a time when politics was practiced intelligently for the good of the whole nation. Back then, the future mattered. Respect and integrity mattered, and facts, imagination, science, accuracy and honesty were all valued. Truth as the basis of debate mattered. Our diversity flourished and was celebrated. All manner of pursuits, cultural, educational, imaginative, innovative, traditional, were considered worthy alongside our sport. Economics was important, and economic policy was transparently approached by government, so people could make a decent life and be secure in knowing that their children would be educated and other foundational needs would be met. Aspiration was understood as being not only personal but also communal, end quote. Criticism of Australia's political leadership is not new, of course. Those of you who have read Donald Horne's 1964 book, The Lucky Country, will know that, contrary to what most of Australia likes to believe, Horne did not mean the term as a compliment. Rather, he intended it as a warning, indeed 3 loud warnings about the future of Australia. These were that it was essential to accept the challenges of where Australia is on the map, the need for a revolution in economic priorities, and the need for a bold redefinition of what the whole place adds up to now. When he used the term lucky, it was ironic. Quote, Australia is a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. Although its ordinary people are adaptable, most of its leaders so lack curiosity about the events that surround them that they are often taken by surprise, end quote. About the politicians, he said, quote, it is certainly the belief of many Australians that politics is essentially a fraudulent activity engaged in by self-seeking crooks. Even public rhetoric amongst Australian politicians is extremely dour, pragmatic and short-range. In private, they often excuse their participation in politics by boasting of their cynicism. It is as if it would be unmanly and un-Australian for a politician to confess a serious interest in public affairs, end quote. So that was 1964. Between then and now, there were decades when some political leaders at least were different, as Peter Hawke commented. I would like to suggest that one of those leaders who stood out as deeply interested in public affairs, as well as bold and visionary, was Don Dunstan. And a number of the people who have reviewed or written about my biography of Dunstan have made this point. For example, political scientist Alan Patience, who gave me valuable help with my book and has written about it in very generous ways, said of Dunstan that he was South Australia's most successful reforming premier. Quote, like all creative political reformers, Dunstan stood at the margins of conventional society, inviting, persuading and cajoling its obdurate stalwarts and fusty institutions to share his view that society and the economy should work for everyone, not just the privileged few. Dunstan's politics were motivated by a deep moral courage and high intelligence. Voters responded positively to that courage and intelligence, end quote. In the same essay, which was published on a blog in October, Patience called for a change of leadership of the ALP. He called on Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles to stand aside, saying that, quote, it's time for the old guard to step aside for a new generation of Labor MPs. It's time for fresh faces and new ideas. Voters need to be given hope, end quote. He suggested that Tanya Plibersek and Penny Wong should take over. And that the ALP should make finding Wong a seat in the lower house a matter of urgency. He drew parallels between Dunstan and Wong in her policy thinking skills, her ability as a focused critic of her opponents, and as a passionate and informed debater. Arguing that in the 1960s and 70s, the conservative voters of South Australia saw in Dunstan a leader they could believe in, even though they thought he was not like them. Similarly, according to Patience, Wong may not be viewed as, quote, one of us by some conservative Australians, but given a leadership role, she would be quickly recognised as a political leader for our time, and Labor could win government with her at the helm. One review of my book I particularly enjoyed is that by Linda Javen in the Saturday paper, where she wrote that, quote, "When I immigrated to Australia in 1986, this country was notably forward-looking compared with the United States and Britain, where Reagan's and Thatcher's neoliberal policies were busily dismantling civil society and social welfare. Here was universal health care, free tertiary education, and a decent safety net for society's most vulnerable. I found palpable excitement about Australian film, popular music and literature. With Uluru recently returned to its traditional owners, it seemed that Indigenous land rights and the redress of historical wrongs were only a matter of time. Only after reading Don Dunstan, Angela Woollacott's biography of the visionary South Australian Premier, did I realise how much he had done to shape the Australia I fell in love with. 20 years after Dunstan's death and 5 years after Whitlam's, Australia seems a smaller and less generous place. Its politicians, including many in the Labor Party, appear more skilled at invective than the expression of ideals and ideas, and stupidly nervous of supporting Australian culture. We've recently been treated to the spectacle of Tony Abbott, a former Prime Minister, consorting with far-right white supremacists in Europe, even as Labor struggles to persuade voters it believes in anything. Reagan and Thatcher would be delighted, end quote. Excuse me. The Adelaide-based News Corp journalist David Penberthy wrote about my book at some length in both The Australian and The Advertiser. One comment that he made was, quote, "The thing I like about the book is that it scotches the perception of Dunstan as a mad capital L lefty and paints him more accurately as a methodical small L lefty." And he ended his review in The Advertiser this way, quote, "The lesson from this book and his life for the current generations of politicians is a simple one, and it applies across both sides of politics. Just have a go. Stick to your guns and have a go. As Paul Keating said a few years back, too many people in politics these days don't know which side of bed to get out of without a focus group telling them. Not so with the methodical Dunstan, who, even though his bed was often full, would spring out of it each day to make the most polite form of war with the forces of stuffiness that were keeping this staid-old town trapped in the 19th century," end quote. My colleague Chris Wallace, who reviewed the book for both the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, began her review with one of the most salient aspects of Dunstan's leadership: his consistently huge popularity. Quote, "Dictatorships aside, ask anyone to name a head of government whose approval rating was 82% after 6 years in power, and they would say it was a trick question. It is nevertheless true of South Australia's flamboyant and formidably effective Premier Don Dunstan, whose 2 periods in office transformed the state and influenced the nation. Dunstan's story," she continued, quote, "shows that the art of the possible in politics is not always an admonition to be cautious, but rather that what is possible can be expanded through political craft, diligence and daring. This is a vital insight at a time when Australia is plainly flailing. Woollacott's Don Dunstan tells the story of a man central to removing support for the White Australia policy from the federal ALP platform, who led Australia in transforming the rights of Indigenous Australians, people of colour, women and homosexuals, and who made the arts and concern for the quality of urban and working life a visible and vibrant part of his political practice. Dunstan did this in what at the time was arguably Australia's most conservative state. Personally, I would have said Queensland was the most conservative, but anyway, back to Chris Wallace. Subject to a tyrannous gerrymander that allocated Adelaide, with more than 2/3 of the voters, only 1/3 of the South Australian Parliament's lower house seats. What's more, he did it living in a barely concealed open marriage with intimate partners of both sexes, while subject to a whispering campaign that he was a Melanesian orphan half-caste bastard. Against the backdrop of Australia's dire contemporary political culture, Woollacott's book begs the question: What do you do with a politician capable of achieving an 82% approval rating? Answer, study them closely. Disaffection with the democratic process is partly being driven by despair at the leadership choices on offer. Dunstan's example suggests the problem may lie with those currently in the system rather than the system itself. Dunstan did not dumb himself down. He was himself and voters loved him. Plummy voice, ambiguous sexuality, progressive policies and all. Woollacott brings back into view the joy, the ambition, the daring do of a politics that in the current era could be pulled off by Tanya Plibersek or Penny Wong, if either could throw themselves fully into it. May this book be read widely to show how it was done against very high odds, and there is no reason why it cannot be done again. End quote. Perhaps it is appropriate in a world where social media reigns supreme to conclude this list of public comments with a tweet from Jade and David for a Better Australia, who had heard my interview with Philip Adams on Late Night Live and said simply, "Great interview on a poly we need now." Just to conclude this part of the proceedings, I'm from Adelaide and I came of age when Don Dunstan was Premier. I decided to write the book because I had a strong personal sense of how important he was and some idea of what he had done. Yet researching the book, compiling the story of Don Dunstan's intellectual and political development, his career and his lifelong activism, his battles, travails and achievements, has given me greater admiration for his long, hard, committed work to make Australia a better place. I'm especially gratified that reviewers of my book have found in Dunstan a role model for leadership and have drawn on it to add to this growing public debate about what leadership in Australia could and should look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I'd just like to commence this part of our discussion by quoting the last paragraph of your preface. And you say, "There is no doubt that he had a large ego, could be self-indulgent, even at times emotionally fragile, and he had a highly developed sense of loyalty and betrayal. Still, we can see in his life story a politician who held consistent, passionate principles and worked tirelessly towards his goals. If we now live in an era when politics seem driven by self-interest and rivalry, Don Dunstan's life and career present an instructively different model." It's chalk and cheese. You'd hardly juxtapose Don Dunstan with Scott Morrison, would you?
You'd have to see differences, definitely. Yeah. In various ways, in terms of articulateness, amongst other things.
Yeah. Now, one of the focuses of your address just now and in your book is leadership, and perhaps as you comment, perhaps a lost characteristic in this day and age. But in terms of leadership, one of the things that was vital for all of the things, as you've discussed, that Don was eventually able to do with the ALP in this state, was to reform the South Australian Constitution. And the situation when Labor was able to get past the gerrymander and back to power was how bad? How badly skewed was it against the Labor Party?
It was bad, and it had been bad for a long time. So, though it's very interesting, as a historian, I always think it's interesting to know things haven't always been or weren't always like they were. So actually it got particularly bad in the 1930s and then even worse in the 1950s. So it wasn't from the beginning. Anyway, so in the 1930s, the Butler Liberal and Country League government...
And just stopping you there, I think that Butler is Mark Butler's grandfather.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Interesting. And another political dynasty in South Australia like the Downers, and yeah. So they brought in a gerrymander that gave the country seats a much greater weight. So the system was something like that there were 13 seats for Adelaide, even though it had about 2/3 of the voters, and 26 seats in the House of Assembly, this is, for the country seats, even though there were many fewer voters. So there was this huge disproportion. And of course, at the same time, the Legislative Council back then, there was a property qualification on voting. It was voluntary voting, so only a small proportion of people voted, usually landholders, property owners. Then in 1954, the Playford LCL government actually reformed the gerrymander to make it even more strongly in favour of the LCL, so that it actually, because it was what it sought to do was to the metropolitan area was growing, and it sought to kind of quarantine those metropolitan voters by expanding the metropolitan seats. And so that skewing that I just described was even more extreme. So when it was something like Adelaide had 70% of the voters and only 1/3 of the seats in the lower house. It was extraordinary. So that's the year after Don Dunstan was elected in 1953. So, you know, he's elected as a young man, Labor backbencher in 1953, and the system was so skewed against the Labor Party, and it was a huge challenge. And as other commentators like Neil Blewett have said of Don Dunstan, he brought to this huge task, he knew it was going to be a really long-term challenge. He understood that from the beginning. He knew it was going to be complex, it was going to take strategy, it was going to take tenacity. But he brought this unusual combination of radical political vision, seeing the objective, but also the capability of mapping out how to get there step by step. And as various people I've spoken to doing the research for the book have pointed out to me, that's actually an unusual combination in politics, to have that kind of detailed strategy thinking as well as the long-term vision. So he began in the 50s working with his colleagues, urging his colleagues, seeing that they had to start winning marginal country seats, you know, doing really hard campaigning, identifying attractive candidates. But part of the challenge was that many of the seniors in the Labor Party at that time just thought it was inevitable they were in opposition. The system was so stacked against them that there was no way they could win. So they just accepted things as they were. So Dunstan and his other younger and more energetic colleagues had to convince the elders in the ALP at the time that it was worth working hard and campaigning hard. So gradually, one by one, through the 50s into the 60s, the ALP wins enough seats that by the mid-60s they're in contention. In 62, actually, they were getting close. Then 65, finally, they come to power against the gerrymander. And then Dunstan, so it's Frank Walsh, and then Dunstan takes over as Premier in 67. 1968 is a really interesting election. Gerrymander's still in place, and the Dunstan government wins about 54% of the vote and did not get the government because of the gerrymander. And because it's 1968 and, you know, their kind of political activism is ramping up around the world, and students are becoming very interested in democracy and political systems. And Dunstan was very strategic here too. He refused to step up. Partly he could do this because there were one or two seats that were in tight contention, they were recounting. But he refused to step aside for 6 weeks after the election. And it gave him a window of opportunity to go around the country, not just here in South Australia, but he went around the country basically campaigning about the gerrymandered system in South Australia and turning it into a national issue. Students here protested along with others. There was a rally of 10,000 people. So it became such an issue that when, in fact, the Liberal Party was returned with Steelhall as Premier, Steelhall actually was kind of embarrassed, partly out, I would give Steelhall credit that it was partly out his own sense of the need to do something, but also this strong sense of embarrassment that he did then reform the system enough that in 1970, when the ALP got the same result as 1968, they won power comfortably. So it was a long haul, and I think that shows one of the key attributes of Dunstan's leadership, that he was capable of seriously working towards an objective that others thought was impossible, something that was a really huge goal to be attained, and to work long-term with strategy and tenacity.
And just before we leave the gerrymander, just to show you what an enormous task it was, as you said, the Adelaide area had about 70% of all voters, but it was allocated 13 seats. There were 26 country seats, but the even more extraordinary detail is that each of the city seats had about 22,300 voters, and the country seats had 6,600. So it really was quite shameless, wasn't it?
It was really shameless. It was just, shocking when you look back at the statistics now.
Now, you talk in your book about leadership, but you also talk about the characteristic of Don, of his boldness.
Yeah.
He was prepared to do things in quite an unusual way and to strike out on his own initiative. And in that respect, I want to ask you a little bit about his boldness in the arts and the sorts of pioneering things he did, which are still with us today. Now, he didn't invent the Adelaide Festival, but he certainly crafted some changes which are still with us today. Now, people often cavil at the idea that Don Dunstan was responsible for the festival centre, and they insist on Steele Hall's role. But I think you can tell us the actual story.
So the festival centre was actually planned from the early 1960s onwards, so it wasn't really either Steele Hall or Don Dunstan who can take the credit for the idea, and to some extent it was the Adelaide City Council. And then, so Dunstan, when he was Premier 67 to 68, became very interested. So the plans had started. There was quite a long debate about where it was going to go. So there was plans at one stage for a theatre building up on Montefiore Hill. And then there was debate about when this area was settled on, where it should be in this area. But Dunstan was involved in it in 67, 68. Then Steele Hall, when things were getting to a serious stage with the plans for it, he became Premier and he very much advanced it, and he definitely deserves some of the credit. But when Dunstan was re-elected in 1970, he just absolutely threw himself into it because the arts were so, it was such a matter of passionate interest for him. Dunstan cared deeply about the arts, so they were very close to his heart, his interests. He had a background in amateur theatre from student and Adelaide Uni days, played the piano, had studied at the conservatorium. So the arts were really important to him. So what he was responsible for really was expanding the festival theatre to the scale that it became, and he took land from the railways in order to do that. He was responsible for making sure it was a multi-venue performing arts centre.
And it came in a lot cheaper than the Opera House too, I think.
It did. It's pretty much in time. You can compare it to the Opera House, and many people thought that it was more functional and it was certainly a lot cheaper than the Opera House.
One of the things I noticed from your book is that in April 1972, under Dunstan, the South Australian Parliament passed the South Australian Theatre Company Act, which is, there are not that many theatre companies in the world established by Act of Parliament, but that then was something that Don fostered to bring it to be the state theatre company we know today.
Exactly. So, again, this was part of his boldness, that he was willing to actually put political capital into establishing and fostering the arts. And it's important to think that while, we now benefit from cultural investment in the arts in various ways, in the 1960s it was just starting. Government investment in the arts was just starting around the country. And of course, just on that topic, I would say, I think these days there's been a lot of funding cuts to the arts. As a Canberran, watching the National Library cut its staff and its publishing program and open later, kind of makes one weep. But anyway, Dunstan was willing to go out on a limb in an area that was not an area that not only had there not been a huge amount of government investment, it was not an area that Labor had been known to have a lot of interest in, and it wasn't an area that all of his colleagues felt equally invested in, so he really had to show leadership in order to do that kind of investment. And yes, it was unusual for a state theatre company to be established by Act, but he also, with other areas of the arts, he was willing to use the power of the government to establish them bodies by Act, but also to help bodies like when the South Australian Film Corporation was established in 74, also established legally. But that too, he allowed such bodies to borrow money semi-governmentally in ways that hadn't traditionally been done to ensure that they could get properly established. So he used his leadership, and he created a position in the Premier's Department of an officer for performing arts and tourism. From the beginning, he saw cultural tourism as having an economic role, as being an economic stimulus, and I think that's a really important part of the picture that he should be given credit for, that he saw the economic benefit of stimulating the arts.
And at the same time as using the power of the government to expand the arts sector, he also, perhaps paradoxically, would use the power of the government to get censorship changed, so that the arts that were flourishing could flourish more properly, because I think censorship was pretty drastic in those days before Don.
Australia had an amazingly rigorous and complex censorship system up until the 1960s. There's been a wonderful book written by Nicole Moore, The Census Library, huge book, because Australia's censorship operated both at state level and federally, and it was so complex and it was so invasive, intrusive and repressive compared to other governments around the world. So there were instances, for example, of a book that was published in New Zealand and in bookshops that would say banned in Australia. This was a reason why New Zealanders should read it. We had a really seriously repressive system here. And civil liberties were very important to Dunstan always. So, for example, there's a wonderful photo of him posing reading The Trial of Lady Chatterley. You just need to look at the photo to see the point. He spoke out on civil liberties and censorship from the 1960s onwards. So, yes, this was an area that he was important in relaxing censorship here.
I'd like you to talk to us a bit about the way he used the media. I think your assessment in your book was that he was a pretty brilliant user of the media to get to his ends.
He was, from early on. So he was telegenic, and that helped, but he was also quite strategic and creative. Even as early as the late 1950s, he was thinking about the design of election leaflets in ways that other politicians hadn't thought about. And he used the media in various ways. He was an earlier adopter of opinion polls, but unlike other politicians, he didn't use opinion polls to decide what his policies were. He knew what his policies were. He used opinion polls to know what voters were thinking so that he could explain his policies to voters. But he also used, partly because of his background in amateur theatre and being, a kind of a consummate performer in a number of ways, performing in the Adelaide Festival of Arts, but also I think many people would say that politics inevitably has an element of performance, and he did that very well. And he used moments when the media were paying attention brilliantly, and there were a couple of episodes when he used the media particularly effectively in the Building Society one, I think was late 1975, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so
That was the Hindmarsh Building Society.
Yes.
In Gawler Place, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
So there was the episode where rumour went around that the Building Society was about to become insolvent, go bankrupt, and it wasn't true. Dunstan looked into it and found out that it was solvent, that there was no problem, but people were so worried that a queue of people with accounts formed in the street, and Dunstan went down to the scene with a megaphone and reassured everybody that everything was fine, and the media covered it and the word got out, so then things calmed down. But even more wonderfully, dramatically, was the episode in January of 1976. Some of you may remember this, and this was the supposed tidal wave at Glenelg. So there was it's so funny looking back on it, there was a local house painter who claimed clairvoyance and who said that because of sexual permissiveness in Adelaide, God was going to visit his wrath on the city, and there was going to be a massive earthquake and a tidal wave at Glenelg on the 19th of January. So, absurd, and Dunstan at first tried to ignore it, but the media blew it up and it became a thing. To the point that some people were really panicking. In fact, some people fled Adelaide. There was a caravan park on the River Murray that reported about 100 people showed up on the night of the 18th of January. So Dunstan finally said, okay, I will go to Glenelg. At noon was the hour that it was supposed to happen. I will go to Glenelg. So this was a moment when he really used the media terrifically. By the time he got to Glenelg, there were thousands of people there. It was quite a scene. There were people selling surfboards and snorkels as survival kits. And there were some people, preaching repentance to avoid the divine wrath. So this, then there was this huge excitement. Dunstan arrives, then the hour passes, nothing happened. He got up on the balcony of the Pier Hotel and waved to the crowd. It turned into a party. And so then he became known as a local King Canute. But it was It was a hugely successful media event for him because it wasn't only that the local media were covering it wall to wall. There were reporters from Britain, Japan and Hong Kong there, so it became an international thing. And, he hadn't quite walked on water, but one reporter described it when he got there as being like the second coming. So.
And Angela, could you tell the folks the story about the day that Don went off the reservation and escaped his staff, and it resulted in one of the most iconic images that we have of Don?
Yes, I always have such mixed feelings myself about the iconic photo about Don Dunstan on the steps of Parliament House in the famous tight pink shorts and the white T-shirt. And I have mixed feelings because so often, I've been working on this book since 2011. People say in conversation, "You're a historian, what are you working on?" I say, "I'm doing a biography of Don Dunstan." "Oh, pink shorts." Well, why do we care that he wore pink shorts? We care because he was so important politically. We care because of what he did politically and intellectually. But of course, his sexuality, his bisexuality was very much an important part of politically what he stood for, and I understand that. I just wish that people knew something about him other than the pink shorts. But the story, it is an interesting story because I was told by one or two of his staff who were working with him at the time that when he showed up at work that day, and he actually wore and I think it's significant, it wasn't just the pink shorts, it was a white T-shirt. A white T-shirt was really very casual, and he wore it into Parliament, and, it created a bit of a sensation there. But his staff tried desperately to keep him away from the cameras all day until I think it was about 4:00. He actually snuck out of the back of Parliament House and around to the front steps, and the media had been, somehow they knew and they were there and the photo was taken. He was being really willful. It was clearly he wanted to be seen. I actually think part of it was he had, at that point, for some years been working out at the gym a lot, and he was looking pretty buff. And I really think that was part of it.
Now, in terms of his political legacy, Angela, one of the points surprised me was that Don was not a man for factions.
Exactly. So he had a number of political beliefs that he felt strongly about and that he reiterated over the years, and that I think we can see as kind of his political legacy, things that we should consider part of what are very relevant now for us in looking at the legacy he has left us. And one is that he was very much a critic of factions in political parties. He himself ran things with a consensus style, and in fact South Australia was known particularly for the South Australian Labor Party was seen as having more of a consensus style in the post-war decades than some of the eastern states. Partly we avoided the DLP split, which happened so badly. It wasn't as bad here as in New South Wales and Victoria. But Dunstan felt very strongly about running things by consensus and that factions shouldn't be there. And he really rued the fact that particularly after he left politics, that factions within Labor became so powerful. He talked later about the power of the centre-left faction and even called it a monster. And he said at one point that any party within which groups meet separately is doomed. And I think that's pretty powerful for us these days. When we look at all of our major political parties, they all have strong factional systems within them, and I think it's sobering.
You've mentioned civil liberties, censorship and the like. I'd like to suggest perhaps one of the most eventful matters relating to civil liberties during Don's period in power was what became known as the Salisbury Affair. And Adelaide Writers Week is known for the youthfulness of its audience, so perhaps you could tell these youngsters...
How long have you got?
Perhaps you could give us a sketch of what happened in the Salisbury Affair.
It's a really important part of his career, and if you're interested, I would recommend reading that part of the book. It was... I always knew from the beginning of the project it was going to be a complicated part of the book to write, and it was to get it straight. And it, to some extent, the quote-unquote Salisbury Affair, I think, marred the end of his career in a way that was unfortunate. So, as you may know, at the beginning of 1978, Don Dunstan sacked the police commissioner Harold Salisbury, who he had appointed some years before. There'd been a recruitment process. Salisbury was recruited from England. He was actually known to have a fairly conservative reputation. Actually, he was like down the list. He wasn't number one or number two. He was down the list. There was no one in South Australia who was appropriate. Anyway, so the issue was about the fact that the police were keeping secret files, including secret files on homosexuals, and they were keeping them in ways that were clearly not to do with security. They were keeping files that weren't really about what should have been policing matters. They were keeping them about issues of morality and politics, because the files that they were keeping also included people on the left, Labor figures, but also civil liberties advocates. A whole range of people on the left had files that should never have been there. So civil liberties was part of the background to why Dunstan sacked Salisbury, but it's important that the actual crux of the matter was that Dunstan not only was absolutely constitutionally within his powers to sack Salisbury, really he had no choice but to do it, because Salisbury misled the Premier, and the Premier then in turn misled the Parliament. So the police commissioner knowingly, willfully misled the government and denied being directly responsible to the government. Well, in the Westminster responsible government system, the police commissioner is responsible to the government. There is no question about that. And constitutional lawyers, scholars who have looked at this in the years since, have said there is absolutely no question that Salisbury misleading the government was so wrong, and his view, this weird view that somehow he wasn't responsible to the government, was so wrong that he really had to be sacked. But there has been debate around whether Dunstan perhaps could have handled it a little more adroitly politically, because it did do a lot of damage. It became immediately a hugely controversial matter. South Australians were shocked that their police commissioner was sacked. They didn't know any background. So it did Dunstan a lot of damage. It caused him a lot of grief. And I think perhaps he could have somehow handled it a little bit more strategically, or drawn it out more to give the public more notice. But he had no choice but to do it.
Yeah, and it's pretty astonishing for us sitting in 2020 to look back into 1978 and understand that there was a significant body of opinion that agreed with the police commissioner, that he had some sort of residual authority apart from the government.
It's a very strange thing. Constitutions are complicated, and the system of responsible government is a very complicated one. So I think perhaps not everybody was fully aware of the constitutional dimensions to this. But it is very clear now, and many scholars have pointed this out, that, Salisbury was absolutely in the wrong, and he really needed to be sacked, to be fired.
Now, Angela, many of your listeners here today would be unaware of something that struck me from your book in terms of the very partisan politics we have today, is that Don Dunstan and Tom Playford actually got on very well.
They did. It was a curious relationship, because actually they also were political enemies, particularly in debate in the House of Assembly. They would spar bitterly at times. But this was something that I didn't know until I was doing the research for the book, that they actually had this surprising friendship and a lot of respect for each other that survived both their times in office, so that there was a friendship that continued. And I think it's very interesting, when we look, I think when people look at the most important premiers of South Australia, and it's a short list, Tom Playford and Don Dunstan both are on that short list. And people think of Playford as very conservative, but actually Playford's politics were quite complicated. And Don Dunstan, in his last major public address, it was a public lecture that he gave 10 months before he died in April of, 1998. And he gave Playford's governments a lot of credit for the ways in which they had blended the public sector and the private sector. So he talked, for example, about the public support of the forestry industry in South Australia as having done the state a lot of good. the public system of the electricity and water supply department that had been set up in the 50s, that was publicly owned and that was functioned well. And he talked about how that had benefited the state, and the context for doing this was decrying the privatisation of water and electricity in South Australia, saying that those had been a mistake. But it really is such an interesting relationship. Dunstan and Playford at times really were quite bitter enemies in the House, for example, over the Rupert and Maxwell Stewart case in the late 1950s. And yet I've been told that not infrequently when Playford was Premier and Dunstan was in opposition, that because Playford would be going up to the hills and Norwood was on the way, Playford would say, "Do you want to lift home in the government car?" And they would chat on the way. And there are other pieces of evidence of the friendship continuing. 1976, Don Dunstan's 50th birthday party, and Tom Playford attended that. There's a wonderful photo of Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke and Tom Playford and Don Dunstan at the party. And I mean, you would know that Tom Playford did not drink, so it wasn't as though he was particularly a party person, but there he was. And then also Don Dunstan in office as Premier, I've been told by Stephen Wright, his executive secretary, that there were times when Dunstan was trying to nut through some issue and he would say, "Send the car for Tom," because he wanted to talk to Tom Playford to have Tom help him think through an issue. So I think it's a really intriguing, politically, historically important friendship for South Australia.
Yeah. Now, we've probably got about 10 minutes to go, so if anybody would like to ask Angela a question, I think there's only the one microphone. I don't really remember what I was told, but just make your move. It is only one. So just move towards that if you would.
Yeah, look, something that you haven't touched on, part of Dunstan's brilliance, as I understand it, when he had to become leader of the Labor Party, and the Labor Party in the 1960s was not anything like Don Dunstan, certainly not predominantly bisexual and interested in the arts and so forth. Could you care to comment on how or why he was able to get to that position?
Thank you. That is an interesting question. And, it was often commented during his career that he wasn't like so many other Labor politicians. Partly he had a very privileged education. He'd been to St Peter's and then Adelaide Uni and lived at St Mark's and become a lawyer. And, compared to the model that had been dominant in the Labor Party prior to that of, people who had come up through the trades and the union movement, and Frank Walsh, who became the Labor Premier in 1965 when Labor did return to power, was a stonemason. So Don Dunstan was different. I think part of the answer is that it's a complex. I think there are several reasons. One is that it was so clear that Don Dunstan was so smart and so politically talented that even his colleagues who knew that he wasn't like them really respected him and saw him from really early on as a future leader. So I think, from the 50s, people were looking at him that way. He also had some powerful mentors and supporters in the South Australian Labor Party, Jim Toohey and Clyde Cameron. If you've ever read Clyde Cameron's memoirs, he basically takes credit for Don Dunstan's career. He basically said, "I spotted him from the beginning and I did everything. I made sure he got pre-selection in 1953. He actually claims he rigged the tickets for delegates to make sure that Dunstan got pre-selection, and that he pushed him. And there is a great story about Frank Walsh really did not want to step aside in 1967. And Clyde Cameron just decided he was going to push him. So there was a state conference, I think it was, and Clyde Cameron got up and made this speech congratulating Frank Walsh on his decision to retire, which he hadn't decided at all. And everybody got to their feet and applauded, and it was so clear everybody else wanted this to happen. And Walsh came down from the stage and anyway, off the stage, said to Cameron, where did you get that bloody et cetera, from? And said, I'm not going to retire, but within weeks he did. So I think that was part of it. But I think also, in a way, there's a broader thing happening in the ALP. There was at that time a broader thing happening in the ALP, that there was actually a class shift, a generational shift happening in the ALP in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And of course, Gough Whitlam was also very different from the traditional Labor model. And he was elected to federal parliament in 53, same year that Don Dunstan was elected to the state parliament. So I think there's a broader phenomenon too.
Oh, thank you, Angela, for a wonderful book, which was a pleasure to read from beginning to end. I just wanted to say that last year, which was 125 years since female suffrage in South Australia, there were all sorts of occasions to celebrate that. At one of these, I was invited to talk to a group of schoolgirls, the secondary schoolgirls, not primary, and I found to my horror, not one of them had ever heard of Don Dunstan. What does this say about our education system, and what should we do about it?
I think everyone should know this is the Honourable Anne Levy who's just asked this question. Thank you, Anne.
And Anne, of course, was the first woman elected head of the upper house in this state.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. Of course, it's not just high school girls who are ignorant of Don Dunstan. Essentially, I'm a historian, I teach history, that's my stock in trade, and, I spend my career being amazed by what students don't know about Australian history. And, because it's my field, I would say that there's not enough Australian history in our school curriculum. And actually, I have to say South Australia is actually a bit worse than some of the other states in this regard. There's more history in the New South Wales and Victorian school curricula than there are here. I think we need more history, historical awareness, and we need to know more about important leaders, a range of important leaders in the past. One of the reasons I decided to write a comprehensive biography was because it seemed to me it was very important that there be a full comprehensive biography of Don Dunstan. There had been other work, but I thought not yet a full proper comprehensive biography. So that's why I decided to spend years doing it, and I hope that will help with broader knowledge of Dunstan's legacy and contributions.
Angela, in that final speech that Dunstan made in Adelaide, which you referred to, he concluded with that often quoted remark, intervene or we sink. And I think he was primarily thinking of matters economic, although more broadly. When you were doing the history and you looked at the trajectory of Don's life, did you detect any pattern where, as the years went by, he became bolder, he became more imaginative, he became more ambitious, he became more progressive, if you like, in a sense that, of course, would be a contrast with the typical trajectory, unfortunately, of most Labour Party politicians. And was it, in part, that constant moving to be bolder that was a fundamental key to Dunstan's effectiveness and to his success?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is a little complicated. I think in one important aspect that I see now in terms of looking at Dunstan's leadership and legacies for us is that he was actually remarkably consistent. So Dunstan's parents were politically conservative, but as a university student in the mid-1940s, reading politics and history and reading widely, and he settled on his own personal political convictions, which was democratic socialism. And once he got there, he stayed there for the rest of his life. So I think that he was remarkably consistent, and he was very clear. He could articulate why his views were that way and what his beliefs were. And I think he was bold in office from the beginning. But there were some things that I think maybe are along the lines you're suggesting of being a bit bolder to later on. One thing is that Towards the end of his time as Premier, there were some things that he was looking at doing that he didn't get to do that I think were a bit more radical. One was he was looking seriously at decriminalising marijuana. So that's 1978, we're talking about. Another thing that he was looking at very seriously in the late 70s was industrial democracy and, worker participation in management, which at the time was considered really quite radical, although, in subsequent decades, the idea of worker representatives on boards at various levels has become fairly mainstream, actually. Another thing that he did actually shift on, that he later in life, he did say he had changed his views on. He was very active in the federal ALP, and he was on the Foreign Affairs and Territories and Immigration Committee, and he was on the committee that approved the US base at the Northwest Cape, which was quite controversial. And later in life, he said if he had that decision again, he wouldn't have done it. Later in life, he became much more sceptical of the Australian alliance with the United States, much more worried about it. So I think that is one thing he did shift on.
Thank you. I think you've given us a very good overview of Donald Dunstan. There's much more to him than pink shorts on the steps of Parliament House. But would you also add to the list of adjectives about him being an internationalist? You've mentioned the foreign affairs aspect, but it seems to me that he was very strong on human rights, not just in Australia, but also he was totally opposed to the war in Vietnam. He was also very strongly supportive of the East Timorese resistance, and he spoke at public meetings, he chaired public meetings, and only a few months before he died he attended a protest. Organisers asked him if he'd be prepared to speak, and he said no, he was too sick, but he felt it was important to be there. And so the other thing I want to raise is, do you think he would have made a much better Prime Minister than Gough Whitlam?
Wow, that's a lot. On the last one, I think he wouldn't have done the crash through or crash thing like Gough Whitlam. And many people wanted him to go federal, but that's a whole complicated topic. You're absolutely right about him being an internationalist, and he was that from early on. He was he was not only a democratic socialist, he was a Fabian socialist. He did belong to a quite specific organisation of Fabian socialists who were internationalists, and he had international connections, and that was an important part of his political views. And throughout his career, he spoke up on international and was active on issues that were to do with internationalism, anti-colonialism and pro-human rights. So, for example, in 1957, he went to Cyprus on a study tour looking at what the British government were doing with the military repression that they were instigating there to control civil unrest, and criticised the fact that they were rounding people up and putting them in concentration camps and so forth. And went to London and spoke out publicly against it. Later in life, he was a leader of an Australian leader of the movement for democracy in Fiji after Fiji started its series of coups. He also was a leader of the Nelson Mandela Foundation of Australia. So there were many ways in which what you say is true.
I'm afraid that's our allotted time. That's why you heard the applause from the West Stage. And so that brings to the further questions perhaps you can ask Angela directly as she signs your copy. And it's been a magical journey back to our old half-caste Melanesian bastard. Could you please thank Angela Woollacott?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, if you seek his monument, look around you.